And welcome back. Let's go ahead and look at a couple programming examples here for comparing strings. Now, the two things that we have most compared our strings for have been to ultimately do two things. First is to test for equality, or pretty much seeing whether or not two strings are equal to one another, or to test whether or not something is in a certain order, such as alphabetical order. And so we're going to go ahead and look at both here today, and we're going to, of course, see what we get. So to start us off, I have a quick scanner here class. I created a string str1, set a computer input, which I'm going to let the user define. So first, let's just test these strings for equality. Remember, no matter what we're going to do here with this program, the way we go about addressing this is we use an if statement. So we're going to go ahead and let str1 and see if that is equal to input. And use my curly brackets here to show this, and I'm going to say if they're equal, I can just do a simple system.out.println, and I'm going to go ahead and say the strings are equal. And then let's just do an else here because it's always good to know whether or not they're equal. So we are just going to add a corresponding system.out.println. The strings are not equal. All right, and that's a quick test for equality. Now, if we wanted to get more specific, we could, of course, do this to see if they're equal when we ignore case. And the way I could do that is very easy. I just change this to equals ignore case. In fact, I could even just copy this whole line of code here, add this in. I'm just going to shift this back here using Shift Tab, bring that over for equality, ignoring case. And all I do is I change this from equals to equals ignore case. And that will, of course, work exactly the same as we do up here. In fact, it's going to test exactly on strings, except it's going to give, a more vague definition here because it's an equals ignore case. So if we want to make this more precise, I can, of course, are equal when ignoring case. It's always good to be very specific here in our output statements because otherwise, well, these would look exactly the same. And so we could end up with two different results here. And so this way I can differentiate whether this is equal when ignoring case. Awesome. Now what about that alphabetical test? This is something we just looked at before. And this, again, we're going to use a if statement. And we're going to str1 dot, and what method am I going to use here? Well, I'm going to use the compare to method. And I want to compare that to input. So I'm going to change that to input. And if I just go ahead and put the curly bracket here, one of the most common things I see here with compare to is people put this in like, why isn't this working? Why isn't my code actually working here? I have an error message. I have compare to in here because remember, compare to is only part of what we want here. We have to actually complete this expression here by putting in an inequality. So for example, we want to say if this is less than 0, now you'll notice we no longer get an error. And remember, if it's less than 0, that means it's coming before here. So this would be our print line statement now. And we can say the string, and I'm just going to concatenate this in with str1 comes before the user input string of, and let's go ahead and put this in with another concatenation, and this will be input. All right, so that looks pretty good. But of course, remember when we do a alphabetical test, we of course have to have a else if in here to test for when it is greater than. So I'm going to flip that around. And I also need an else in here that simply just would say if they're equal. Now, we already actually technically know that these are equal. So remember, this would normally, if we look at our example, said the strings are equal, right? System.out.println, the strings are equal. And when we did this, this was great. But if you remember, we also have up in our program here a piece that tells us whether or not this is equal. And so this actually can be a great way to start asking ourselves, is there redundancy in our program? And right now I'm just going to leave these here as is, but I'm going to show you in a second just how to kind of condense our code just a little bit here. That could make our program just a little bit cleaner. So let's go ahead and run this. And let's enter a string to compare. So I'm just going to do computer, but I'm going to do this in all caps. And I hit enter. I get the strings are not equal. The strings are equal when ignoring case. And the string computer comes before the user input string of computer. All right, so we got this here because we're doing alphabetical now, all right, rather than going off of the lexicographic. So if we want to do a lexicographic check, well, actually this is lexicographic right now. I was like, wait a minute here. We actually need to change just to compare to ignore case. So if we're doing a true alphabetical, which is what we're doing here, we want to do ignore case. So let's go ahead and add that back in. So let's do computer. Hit enter. There we go. The strings are equal. Perfect. All right, because we know that these are exactly the same input now because we're ignoring case. And again, if we want to do a lexicographic ordering, we could easily add that in here. We would just have to, of course, add in this back to simply just being compared to. And that could work. And of course, change this ordering here a little bit. But I'm going to take this out for now because I'm just going to leave alphabetical in here. And again, I want to show you how you can condense this down. There's two approaches that we could approach this with. One is we could simply just take this else statement off because we've already identified that the string is equal. The other thing we could do is that we could simply take these codes, and since we know that these are testing for equality, well, we could add these in here as additional else if statements. So for example, I could take this statement right here, copy this, and let's just go ahead and I'm just going to add this to the end here and make this into an else if. All right, so now if they're equals, and I'm going to grab the same thing here with the equals ignore case. All right, these of course are going to now function as they're all still part of the same testing block. And again, this is a way for us to clean up code because then we could technically remove this code here if we really wanted to, depending upon which equals we decide to remove. So for example, if I say, hey, you know, I'm going to delete these out of here and I want to test this since this is using ignore case, I probably don't want the equals in here. I probably want equals ignore case since we are, of course, testing very similarly. So I could remove that out here, but I may want to know whether or not those are separate. Ultimately, it just depends on what you want your program to be able to do. But let's just say for now, since we're doing alphabetical and we're ignoring case, let's just go ahead and remove this out of here. Then, since we have this in here, we said the strings are equal in ignore case. Well, we could take this else block out of here, or we could say the strings are, we could also just say the strings are not equal when ignoring case. All right. Again, a lot of this depends on what you want your program to be able to do. And so if we were to rerun this, I'm just going to cut these out just for a second here. I'm just going to take those out. And if we run our program, so we're going to do the same thing, put in computer, all caps. All right, we get the strings are equal when ignoring case. So again, you'll notice exact same thing as what we had before, exact same output, only we condense down our program here. Because notice how much smaller this program is now without all those individual tests. So this is just something that you're going to want to kind of start being aware of how can I take my program and try to make it into less lines of code. Because having the most lines of code doesn't necessarily mean it's a better program. And again, I can put these line of code back in here. This will still, of course, test these, and we would still get, you know, a very similar thing here. So I could again put in the computer, and we will still get the strings are not equal. The strings are equal in ignoring case. The strings are equal in ignoring case because I left this line in here. If I take this out and just use an else and change it back to equal, again, when we do it this way, all right, we get the strings are equal because again, we're using compare to dot ignore case. So you can see how this program can be condensed and how we can start using our different ways of using strings here to really start adding value to a program and use this to start identifying different things we might want to try to solve with our different knowledge that we now have.